It's funny, you know, when we talk about philosophy, we tend to think like big ideas, right? Big thinkers pondering like the meaning of life and all that.
Yeah, the really huge questions.
But what about like the stuff we deal with every day, like money? You know, have you ever thought about how that same kind of deep thinking philosophical approach could apply to something as like down to earth practical as personal finance?
It's not something that immediately comes to mind, is it? Most people probably wouldn't think of philosophy and finance as having much in common.
Right. It's like those subjects live in totally separate worlds.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what we're going to dig into today in this deep dive. We're going to explore the surprisingly deep and sometimes kind of weird connections between these two worlds.
And to help us unpack all this, we're turning to a pretty fascinating resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, specifically their entry on the philosophy of money and finance.
Yeah, it's like our philosophical guidebook for understanding this whole world of money.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't to just get lost in abstract theories. We really want to see how these philosophical ideas play out in the real world, how they affect how we think about and interact with the financial systems all around us.
So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the article starts off with something that I found really surprising. It talks about Thales of Miletus. Now, you know him, right? He's considered the first Western philosopher.
Yeah, the OG philosopher.
But get this, apparently Thales was also kind of a financial whiz. He was like an early innovator in the world of finance. Can you imagine that?
It's a pretty cool little tidbit, isn't it? It
Yeah.
really challenges the image we have of these ancient philosophers, just sitting around in togas debating abstract concepts. Turns out they were wheeling and dealing too.
So what exactly did Thales do that was so financially groundbreaking?
Well, the story goes that he used his knowledge of astronomy and weather patterns to predict a bumper crop of olives. And then he cornered the market on olive presses, the things they use to extract the oil.
So he was like an early commodities trader.
Exactly. It was like an early form of options trading. He was basically betting on the future price of olives and the equipment needed to process them. And he made a killing.
Talk about putting your money where your philosophy is.
Right. And it shows that even back then, people were grappling with questions about predicting the future, managing risk, and understanding value. All very philosophical ideas, really.
It makes you wonder what other hidden financial geniuses are lurking in the history of philosophy.
Maybe we'll uncover a few more as we go along.
Okay, so let's get into some of the big philosophical ideas about money itself.
Mm-hmm.
The article lays out two main theories about what money actually is. The first one is the commodity theory of money. And this one goes way back, like all the way back to Aristotle.
Yeah, this is kind of the classic view of money. It basically says that money is a commodity, something with intrinsic value, something that's useful in and of itself. And it serves three main purposes.
Okay, let's break those down.
All right, so first, it acts as a medium of exchange. It makes it easier for people to trade goods and services. Instead of having to barter, which can be pretty inefficient, you have this common medium that everyone accepts.
It's like that age-old problem of the cobbler needing a loaf of bread, but the baker only wanting shoes. You need something to bridge the gap.
Exactly. Money solves that problem. And then, second, money serves as a unit of account. It provides a common measure of value so you can compare the worth of different things. Like how many loaves of bread does a pair of shoes cost?
It makes the whole economy run more smoothly.
Exactly. And then thirdly, money acts as a store of value. It allows people to save their wealth for the future. You can work today and then hold on to that value in the form of money and then use it later when you need it.
It gives you some economic security.
Precisely. Now, for a commodity to work well as money, it needs to have certain characteristics. Ideally, it should be durable, portable, divisible, and relatively scarce.
So something that's not going to rot away or be too heavy to carry around.
Right. And throughout history, different societies have used all sorts of things as commodity money, things like cattle grain, salt shells, beads, precious metals, you name it.
It's fascinating how people have found ways to assign value to these things and use them as a medium of exchange.
And eventually we see the development of coinage, where governments would mint coins out of precious metals and guarantee their weight and purity. That really helped to standardize things and make trade even more efficient.
It was like an early form of regulation.
Exactly. And even early paper money, like the banknotes issued by the Bank of England, were initially backed by a promise to redeem them for a certain amount of silver. So the idea was that the paper was just representing the underlying commodity.
So it seems like this commodity theory is pretty intuitive, right? It makes sense on a basic level,
Yeah.
but the article also mentions that there are some problems with it.
Yeah, it's not without its critics. One of the main challenges is explaining inflation. The fact that the purchasing power of money tends to decrease over time. If money is just a commodity, why does its value erode?
It's a good question. If it's all about the inherent value of the commodity, shouldn't it stay relatively stable?
That's the logic.
Yep.
But in reality, the value of money fluctuates all the time, and that's something that commodity theory struggles to fully account for. Also, some recent historical research has challenged the traditional narrative that societies neatly progress from barter to commodity money.
So what's the alternative view?
Well, the other main theory about the nature of money is called the credit theory of money, and this one is a bit more abstract.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the credit theory sees money not as a tangible object with inherent value, but as a social agreement, a kind of IOU. It's fundamentally a record of a credit relationship, a promise to provide something of value to whoever holds that token.
So it's not about the thing itself, but the trust and the promise it represents.
Exactly. And for this to work, a couple of things are crucial. One is credibility. The person or entity issuing the money needs to be seen as creditworthy. People need to believe that they'll actually honor their promise.
So it's all about reputation and trust.
Right. And the other key thing is transferability. The credit needs to be easily transferable from one person to another. Other people have to be willing to accept it as payment.
So it needs to circulate within a community.
Precisely. Now, states often play a big role in this because they're generally seen as the most creditworthy entities, which helps explain why state-backed coins and banknotes became so prevalent. But the credit theory also neatly explains the kind of money we mostly use today, fiat money.
Fiat money. That sounds kind of fancy. What's that exactly?
Well, it's the kind of money that isn't tied to a commodity like gold or silver. Its value is essentially determined by government decree, by fiat. And the reason it works is because the state backs it and guarantees its acceptance for paying taxes and debts.
So it's all based on trust in the government.
Precisely. Now, there's a whole theory called chartalism that argues that only states can really issue money in this way because they have the power to levy taxes and enforce the use of their currency.
So it's like a kind of monopoly on money creation.
Exactly. But the article also makes an important distinction between the state issuing money and the state underwriting it. And that's a crucial nuance.
Okay, so what's the difference there?
So in modern economies, most of the money in circulation isn't actually created by the government printing banknotes. It's created by commercial banks when they make loans.
Wait, really? So banks could just create money out of thin air?
Not exactly. It's a bit more complicated than that. But essentially, when a bank approves a loan, they're creating new money in the form of a deposit in your account. They're increasing the money supply.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And the state's role then becomes more about ensuring that these bank-created forms of money are sound, that they can be converted into physical cash if needed. They're essentially underwriting the system.
So it's more of a partnership between the public and private sectors in creating and managing money.
Exactly. Now, of course, the credit theory has its critics too, and their concerns tend to be a bit different from those who critique the commodity theory.
Okay, so what are the main worries about the credit theory?
Well, the big one is the potential for the overexpansion of money. If states and banks have the power to essentially create money out of thin air, the worry is that they might be tempted to do it too much.
Like printing money to get out of debt.
That's one version of it. And this can lead to all sorts of problems, like unsustainable debt levels, inflation, where your money buys less over time, and financial instability, which can ultimately lead to economic crises.
So it's like a balancing act. You need enough money in the system to keep the economy moving, but not so much that it loses its value.
Exactly. Now, some people see this as an argument for going back to something like the gold standard, where the amount of money in circulation is tied to a fixed amount of gold. The idea is to impose stricter limits on money creation.
But others argue that the gold standard is too rigid and can actually hinder economic growth.
Right. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. Now, the article actually offers a more optimistic take on the credit theory. It suggests that understanding money as this social agreement could actually be the key to building a more sustainable and fair financial system.
So instead of seeing it as a problem, the fact that money is a social construct could actually be an opportunity.
Exactly, because if money is something we collectively invent and agree upon, then we can also collectively decide to reinvent it in ways that better serve our shared goals.
It's like we can consciously engineer our financial system to work better for everyone.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another fascinating area, the social ontology of money.
Ontology. That sounds pretty heavy. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically asking, what is the underlying reality of money? How does this whole social construction thing actually work in practice? We've established that it's not just a physical commodity, but a shared belief system. But how does that belief system actually take hold and become real?
It's like we're trying to understand the magic behind the curtain.
Exactly. Now, the article highlights a couple of main philosophical approaches to this. One, drawing on the work of the philosopher John Searle, emphasizes what's called collective intentionality.
Collective intentionality. Okay, I think I need a bit more explanation on that one.
Sure. So it's basically the idea that we can have shared intentions and beliefs as a group. It's not just that I believe something and you believe something, but that we together believe something, and that shared belief has a kind of power in the world.
So it's like a group mind almost.
In a way. And in the case of money, the idea is that someone declares something to be money, a kind of performative act. And when enough people accept that declaration and act as if it's true, it becomes a social rule. It gains a reality that goes beyond any individual belief.
So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief creates the reality.
Exactly. Now, another perspective championed by thinkers like Francesco Guala offers a slightly different angle. They argue that money arises more organically as a practical solution to a social problem. Like the inefficiency of barter that we talked about earlier.
So it's less about a top-down declaration and more about a bottom-up emergence from practical needs.
Right. And this view says that money is maintained not so much through official pronouncements, but simply because it's useful, because it works, because it solves problems.
So in a way, it's like natural selection for social institutions.
Yeah.
The ones that work best survive.
Exactly. Now, of course, these two views aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They might actually complement each other.
It could be a bit of both, right? A combination of collective belief and practical usefulness that gives money its power.
Precisely. So we've got a pretty good handle on the philosophical underpinnings of money. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about finance more broadly. How does that fit into this whole picture?
Yeah, let's expand our horizons.
All right, so the article frames finance as an extension of this monetary system that we've been talking about. And it says that finance generally serves two main functions.
Okay, hit me with them.
All right, so the first is operating an effective payment system, allowing us to easily move money around, make transactions, pay bills, and all that.
The kind of plumbing of the economy.
Exactly. Now, the second function is where things get a bit more interesting from a philosophical perspective, and that's facilitating the efficient use of money.
So it's not just about moving money around, but making sure it's being used in a way that creates value.
Precisely. And this involves a couple of key things. One is connecting those who have surplus money savers and investors with those who need it, borrowers and businesses.
Right, so banks and financial markets play a big role here.
Exactly. They act as intermediaries, channeling funds from those who have it to those who can put it to productive use.
It's all about allocating capital efficiently.
Precisely. And the other key aspect is creating opportunities for people to essentially buy and sell money itself, or rather, claims on future money. And this is where we get into the world of financial products or assets.
So things like stocks and bonds?
Exactly. Each of these financial assets comes with different levels of risk, potential return, and time horizons.
So there's a whole spectrum of options depending on your appetite for risk and your financial goals.
Right. And the modern financial system is this huge complex infrastructure made up of both private entities like banks, insurance companies, investment funds, and public ones like central banks and regulatory agencies.
It's a whole ecosystem of institutions and regulations.
Exactly. And their main job is to facilitate these transactions and ensure the smooth functioning of the financial system.
Now, beyond just physical currency, finance deals with a whole range of these financial assets that you mentioned. What are some of the key ones that stand out from a philosophical perspective?
Well, the article highlights things like credit arrangements. So think bank accounts, loans, bonds, mortgages, basically any agreement where one party lends money to another.
Everyday stuff for most people.
Right. And then there's equity, which represents ownership in a company. So think stocks or shares.
Buying a piece of the pie.
Exactly. Then there are derivatives, which are a bit more complex. These are contracts whose value is derived from the performance of some underlying asset. So things like futures, contracts, options, contracts, swaps, all sorts of complicated stuff.
It's starting to sound a bit like financial alchemy.
It can get pretty arcane. And then there are various types of investment funds which pool money from multiple investors to invest in a diversified portfolio of assets.
Like mutual funds and hedge funds.
Exactly. Now, what's really interesting about all these financial assets from an ontological perspective is that they're often much less tangible than real assets like buildings or machinery.
They're more like ideas or promises than physical things.
Precisely. Much like money itself, they're social constructions representing claims and obligations. They only exist within the framework of this shared belief system that we've been talking about.
So even though they're traded and valued in the market, they don't have any inherent value outside of that system.
Exactly. It's all based on trust and expectations. And even when they are linked to real assets, say owning a share in a company that owns factories, the actual financial transactions often involve trading these abstract contracts, these promises of future value, rather than the underlying factories themselves changing hands.
So it's like we're trading the map rather
Get
than the
that.
territory.
Right, which leads to the idea of the financial market as almost a meta level of the economy. It's this layer where we're not directly trading goods and services, but rather we're trading these abstract representations of value.
So we're betting on the future performance of the real economy.
Exactly. Now, the article points out that most financial assets are essentially promises of future money payments. If we accept the credit theory of money, then these financial assets become, in a sense, meta promises, promises built upon promises.
Whoa, my head's spinning a bit.
Yeah, it can get pretty abstract. The example the article gives is a synthetic collateralized debt obligation, or synthetic CDO.
Try saying that 5 times fast.
I'll pass on that. But anyway, this was one of those complex financial instruments that played a big role in the 2008 financial crisis. And it basically involved betting on a bet about a bunch of mortgages.
So layers upon layers of promises and risks.
Exactly. And the whole purpose of these things was to spread financial risk more widely, in theory anyway.
In theory, right? Which brings up another big philosophical question. Is there such a thing as an intrinsic value of a financial asset?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, especially when we talk about things like asset bubbles, where prices seem to become detached from any underlying value.
Like when the price of a stock or a house skyrockets for no apparent reason.
Exactly. So the rational view, according to the article, is that the intrinsic value of an asset should depend solely on the discounted value of the future cash flow it's expected to generate.
So all those future promises of money?
Right. But even figuring that out involves a lot of subjective judgment and forecasting. Different investors will have different ideas about what those future cash flows will be, which is why they trade in the first place.
Because they're betting on their own predictions.
Exactly. But to make things even more complex, there's this concept of reflexivity, which was famously highlighted by George Soros.
Reflexivity. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
So this is the idea that investors' beliefs and expectations can actually influence the fundamental value of the asset itself. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So if everyone believes that a company is going to be successful, they might invest in it, drive up the stock price, and actually make it more successful.
Exactly. And this can create feedback loops that can amplify both bubbles and crashes. It shows how psychology and social dynamics play a huge role in the financial markets.
It makes you wonder if it's even possible to separate the real value of an asset from all the hype and speculation.
It's a tough question. And all this inherent abstractness and complexity naturally leads us to the next area. The article explores, how do we even form reasonable beliefs about money and finance?
Right. How do we know what to trust in this world of promises and predictions?
And that's where the philosophy of knowledge, or epistemology, comes in.
Okay. I think I need a refresher on epistemology. What's that all about again?
Well, it's basically the study of knowledge. It asks questions like, what is knowledge? How do we acquire it? How do we know if our beliefs are justified? How do we deal with uncertainty and doubt?
So it's about the foundations of our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And when it comes to finance, a central concept here is risk.
Right. Because financial assets are essentially promises about the future. There's always a risk that those promises won't be kept.
Exactly. So a key challenge for investors is developing rational expectations about those future outcomes. And this involves assessing two main things.
Okay. I'm listening.
So first, there's the expected return, which is basically the potential payoff you might get from an investment adjusted for the likelihood of it actually happening.
So it's not just about how much you could gain, but how likely you are to actually gain it.
Right. And then there's the financial risk, which is basically how much those returns might vary. How volatile the investment is, how much uncertainty is there.
So a high-risk investment has the potential for big gains, but also big losses.
Exactly. Now, philosophically, financial risk is really interesting because it's the financial industry's way of trying to manage epistemic uncertainty.
Epistemic uncertainty. That's a mouthful. What's that?
It basically means the fact that we can't know the future with certainty. We have to make decisions based on incomplete information and probabilities.
So risk management is all about dealing with that inherent lack of knowledge about the future.
Precisely. And the financial system is often designed to minimize risk through strategies like diversification,
Yeah.
not putting all your eggs in one basket, spreading your bets.
So if one investment goes sour, you don't lose everything.
Right. But the article also points out a really important criticism of this approach. It says that the standard ways of measuring risk, often just looking at historical price fluctuations, might actually downplay the potential for those really big systemic crises.
The kind of events that nobody sees coming.
Exactly. Those black swan events that can really shake up the whole system.
Yeah.
Relying solely on historical data might give a false sense of security and fail to account for those rare but devastating possibilities.
It's like trying to predict earthquakes based on the average frequency of tremors. You might be missing the big one.
Right. So this leads to some really interesting questions about what our obligations are when it comes to forming beliefs about finance. This is where the idea of the normativity of belief and knowledge comes in.
Normativity.
No.
Yeah, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Sure. So normativity is about what we ought to do, what our obligations are, what's right and wrong when it comes to our beliefs. In this case, it's asking, what are our epistemic duties?
Epistemic duties, so like duties related to knowledge and belief.
Exactly. What are our responsibilities in terms of how we acquire, process, and use financial information, both as individuals and as organizations?
So it's not just about being smart, but about being responsible with your knowledge.
Precisely. Now, this connects to a field called virtue epistemology, which has become increasingly relevant in business ethics.
Virtue epistemology? That sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
So it's basically the idea that there are intellectual virtues, habits of mind that make us better knowers.
So like intellectual curiosity, open-mindedness,
Yeah.
a willingness to consider different perspectives.
Exactly. Those are all good examples. And there's also a focus on intellectual vices, habits of mind that hinder our pursuit of knowledge.
So things like dogmatism, closed-mindedness, wishful thinking.
Right now, in business ethics, there's been a growing interest in examining what are called epistemic failures. Failures in how we acquire, process, and use information.
So not just moral failures, but failures of knowledge and understanding.
Exactly. And this has become especially important in the wake of financial crises like the 2008 crash. Instead of just focusing on the bad behavior, the greed, and the recklessness, there's also a recognition that there were significant failures of knowledge and understanding that contributed to the crisis.
So like people not really understanding the risks they were taking, the complexity of the financial instruments they were dealing with.
Exactly. Or organizations failing to have adequate checks and balances in place to prevent bad decisions.
It's like a systemic lack of intellectual virtue.
In a way. Now the article talks about the importance of organizations cultivating what's called corporate epistemic virtue.
Corporate epistemic virtue. Okay, now we're getting really fancy. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically about creating an organizational culture that promotes those intellectual virtues that we talked about.
So making sure that the right people have the right knowledge and skills for their roles.
Exactly. And supporting good information gathering practices, making sure that information flows freely within the organization and that people are encouraged to challenge assumptions and speak up when they see something wrong.
It's like creating a culture of intellectual honesty and accountability.
Right. And the article uses the example of the Madoff Ponzi scheme to illustrate how a lack of proper due diligence can be seen as a major epistemic failure.
That was a huge scandal, right? Where this guy, Bernie Madoff, defrauded investors billions of dollars.
Yeah, it was one of the biggest financial frauds in history. And it went on for years because people didn't ask the right questions or didn't dig deep enough into the evidence.
They were too trusting or maybe too greedy to see the red flags.
It was probably a combination of factors. But the point is that it wasn't just a matter of individual moral failings. There were also systemic epistemic failures at play.
So like a failure of the collective intelligence of the system?
Exactly. Now, the article also brings up the interesting relationship between accounting firms and the companies they audit. It views them as a kind of joint epistemic agent.
Joint epistemic agent? That sounds like a pretty close relationship.
It is. So the idea is that the auditors are supposed to provide justification for the financial statements that companies put out based on the evidence that the company provides.
So they're like the independent verifiers of the company's financial health.
Exactly. But this immediately highlights the potential for conflicts of interest. The auditor is being paid by the very firm they're supposed to be scrutinizing.
So there's a built-in tension between their duty to the public and their loyalty to their client.
Right. And that can lead to all sorts of ethical dilemmas. Now, this whole idea of epistemic virtue isn't just for the financial professionals themselves. The article stresses how crucial it is for financial regulation as well.
So the people who are supposed to be overseeing this system need to be intellectually virtuous too.
Exactly. The failures of credit rating agencies in the 2008 crisis are a perfect example of what can go wrong when you have a widespread epistemic failure.
Those are the agencies that gave AAA ratings to all those risky mortgage-backed securities, right?
Exactly. They essentially gave a seal of approval to investments that turned out to be incredibly dangerous. And the article suggests that the way the system was set up, where investors were often legally required to rely on these ratings, might have actually discouraged them from developing their own critical thinking skills when it came to assessing risk.
So it's like the system created a kind of epistemic dependency.
It's a fascinating argument. It suggests that sometimes too much reliance on experts can actually undermine our own ability to think critically.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be informed and to question what we're told, even when it comes from authority figures.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another really interesting concept that the article introduces: epistemic injustice.
Epistemic injustice. Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. What's that all about?
So it's a concept developed by the philosopher Miranda Fricker. And it basically refers to situations where someone is wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower.
So it's like being treated unfairly because of your knowledge or lack of knowledge.
Exactly. Now, there are a couple of main types of epistemic injustice that Fricker identifies.
Blame on me.
Right. So one is testimonial injustice, which is basically when someone's testimony is given less credibility than it deserves because of some prejudice or bias against them.
So like if someone's testimony is dismissed because of their race, their gender, their social class, their accent.
Exactly. And this can obviously have serious consequences, especially in situations where someone's safety or well-being is at stake.
It's like being silenced or ignored simply because of who you are.
Right. Now, the other main type of epistemic injustice is hermeneutical injustice.
Hermeneutical injustice. Okay, that one sounds even more complicated. What's that?
So hermeneutics is basically the theory of interpretation. You know, how we make sense of the world, how we understand things. And hermeneutical injustice occurs when someone is prevented from making sense of their own experiences because they lack the necessary conceptual resources.
So it's like not having the words or the concepts to describe what you're going through.
Exactly. And this can often happen to marginalized groups who are excluded from the dominant discourses and power structures.
So their experiences are literally unintelligible because the dominant culture doesn't have a way to understand them.
Right. Now, how does all this relate to the world of finance?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, thinkers like Boudewijn de Bruin have applied the concept of epistemic injustice to financial services. He argues that testimonial injustice can occur when the financial knowledge or insights of certain individuals or groups are unfairly dismissed or not taken seriously because of prejudice or bias.
So like if a woman's financial advice is ignored or downplayed because of sexist stereotypes.
Exactly. Or if someone's concerns about a financial product are dismissed because of their race or their social class.
It's like their financial literacy is being questioned simply because of who they are.
Right. And then Lisa Herzog's work looks at the trustee-fiduciary relationship, you know, where one person is entrusted with managing another person's money. And she argues that hermeneutical injustice can occur in these situations if the financial understanding of the person whose money is being managed is undervalued.
So it's like they're not being given the tools or the knowledge to understand what's happening with their own money.
Right. And this can potentially lead to them being taken advantage of or not having their concerns adequately addressed.
It's like they're being excluded from the financial conversation.
Exactly. So all this to say that issues of knowledge, belief, and justification are absolutely central to understanding how the financial world operates and, crucially, where it can go wrong.
It's not just about numbers and markets, but about power dynamics and who gets to shape our understanding of finance.
Precisely. Now let's move on to another really big area: ethics.
Okay, let's get into the moral dilemmas of money.
All right, so the article dives into a whole range of ethical challenges related to money and finance, starting with that age-old question: is money the root of all evil?
That's a heavy one. It's a question that's been pondered by philosophers and theologians for millennia.
It has, and the article helpfully breaks down the sweeping statement into three main variations.
Okay, let's hear them.
All right, so the first variation is the criticism leveled at the love of money or the pursuit of profit as the primary driver in life.
It's the idea that money can become an obsession, a kind of idol that we worship above all else.
Exactly, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who argued that money has a natural limited purpose as a way to facilitate exchange.
It's a means to an end. not an end in itself.
Right, and that desiring it endlessly as an end in itself is somehow unnatural and can lead us astray.
It can corrupt our souls and make us lose sight of what's truly important in life.
Exactly. Now, Karl Marx echoed this idea with his concept of commodity fetishism.
Commodity fetishism. That sounds pretty intense. What's that all about?
Well, it's the idea that under capitalism, we tend to treat commodities, including money, as if they have magical powers, as if they're the source of value, rather than just representations of value.
So we become obsessed with accumulating things and making money, even if it doesn't actually bring us happiness or fulfillment.
Exactly. And this can lead to a kind of alienation from ourselves, from each other, and from the products of our labor.
So it's not just about greed, it's about a distorted relationship with the material world.
Exactly. Now, the second variation of the money is the root of all evil criticism focuses on the potential for moral corruption.
It's the idea that the love of money can lead to all sorts of negative traits, like selfishness, greed, dishonesty, a willingness to exploit others.
Exactly. You know, the classic image of the greedy banker who's willing to do anything to make a buck?
It's a stereotype, of course, but it's one that has a lot of cultural resonance.
It does. And the very high levels of compensation in the financial industry, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis when many people were struggling financially, really fueled these accusations.
It created a perception that the financial elite were out of touch with the rest of society and motivated solely by self-interest.
Exactly. Now, the third variation of this criticism draws on the work of Immanuel Kant.
Immanuel Kant. That's a big name in philosophy. What was his take on all this?
Well, Kant was all about duty and moral principles. And he argued that when our primary motivation is profit, it might indicate the absence of more morally commendable motives.
So like acting out of a sense of duty or treating other people as ends in themselves rather than just as means to our financial goals.
Exactly. So from a Kantian perspective, the pursuit of profit isn't inherently wrong, but it can be problematic if it becomes our sole driving force.
It's like we need to have a moral compass that guides our financial decisions.
Precisely. Now, it's important to note that there are also defenses of the profit motive.
Okay, so what are the counter-arguments?
Well, one of the most famous is Adam Smith's invisible hand argument.
Oh yeah, the idea that individual self-interest can actually lead to benefits for society as a whole.
Exactly. You know, the classic example is the baker who's not baking bread out of the goodness of his heart, but because he wants to make a profit. But in doing so, he's also providing a valuable service to the community.
So greed can actually be good for society in a roundabout way.
In a way. Now, another defense is the Protestant work ethic, which historically linked the pursuit of profit with virtues like hard work, thrift, and discipline.
It's the idea that financial success is a sign of God's favor and that we should strive to be productive members of society.
Exactly. But as the article points out, it's debatable whether these justifications fully excuse an exclusive focus on profit above all else.
It's like we need to find a balance between the pursuit of wealth and other values like fairness, compassion, sustainability.
Right. Now, the article also tackles another long-standing ethical dilemma, the condemnation of usury and interest.
Usury. That sounds like something out of a Dickens novel. What's that all about?
Well, originally, usury simply meant charging any interest at all on a loan. But over time, it's come to mean charging excessively high interest rates.
Like those payday loan places that charge outrageous fees.
Exactly. Now, this prohibition on usury has roots in both religious and philosophical thought.
So what are some of the main arguments against it?
Well, some of the early philosophical arguments might seem a bit outdated to modern ears. You know, like Aristotle's idea that money begetting money is unnatural, or Thomas Aquinas's view that money is consumed in its use, making interest for its use illegitimate.
Those sound a bit like theological hair-splitting to me.
They do, but the more enduring ethical arguments revolve around issues of justice and inequality.
So the idea that charging interest, especially high interest, can exacerbate the gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. And then it can lead to exploitation of the vulnerable, you know, like those who are desperate for a loan and willing to accept any terms.
It's like preying on people's misfortunes.
Right. Now, religious texts often specifically condemn taking interest from the poor. And there's a concern that usury can create a kind of debt bondage where people are trapped in a cycle of debt that they can never escape.
It's like a modern form of indentured servitude.
In a way. Now, Islamic finance actually prohibits interest altogether based on the argument that it represents unearned income.